The Enigma of Taured, a mystery in Tokyo. Tokyo's Haneda airport was alive with its usual rhythm, a mechanical heartbeat of bustling crowds, rolling suitcases, and the occasional overhead announcement crackling through the speakers. It was mid-afternoon, the kind of humid summer day that clung to your skin, making the chilled air of the terminal a brief, almost cruel, respite. The chaos, though loud, was familiar, almost comforting in its predictability. Then he appeared. At first glance, the man seemed like any other business traveler. Dressed in a well-fitted gray suit, he carried a leather briefcase that looked worn but expensive, its edges slightly frayed from years of use. His face was unremarkable, a clean-shaven, middle-aged man with neatly combed dark hair and a calm expression. He walked with purpose but not urgency, the kind of demeanor that suggested someone well acquainted with international travel. It was his turn at the customs desk. The officer behind the counter greeted him with the detached politeness of someone who had processed thousands of passports that day. The man handed over his documents without hesitation, his movements smooth and practiced. The officer flipped through the passport casually at first, but then his brow furrowed. He flipped back, then forward again, his eyes narrowing slightly as he examined the cover, the stamps, and the information within. "Sir," the officer began, his voice tinged with confusion, "can you confirm your nationality?" The man tilted his head, his expression shifting into one of mild concern. "Of course," he replied in perfect, unaccented English. "I'm from Taured." The officer blinked. He repeated the name to himself silently before glancing down at the passport again. It looked legitimate, an embossed cover, pages filled with official-looking stamps from various countries, and a photograph that perfectly matched the man standing before him. But the word Taured made no sense. "I'll need you to wait a moment," the officer said, gesturing to a nearby seat. The man complied without protest, settling into the chair with an air of practiced patience. Behind the counter, the officer turned to his colleague, showing him the passport. They whispered in low tones, occasionally glancing over at the traveler. Moments later, a supervisor joined them. The document was passed around, examined under a magnifying glass, and scanned into the system. The supervisor finally approached the man. "Sir, could you point out Taured on this map for us?" he asked, unfolding a large map of the world on the desk. The traveler rose and stepped forward, his finger gliding confidently over the paper. "Here," he said, tapping a spot between France and Spain. "That's Taured. It's been there for centuries." The supervisor exchanged a glance with the customs officer. "That's Andorra," he said carefully, as though speaking to someone who might be confused. The traveler frowned, his calm demeanor faltering slightly. "No," he insisted. "This is Taured. I've lived there my entire life. I've traveled internationally for years, this can't be the first time someone's seen a Tauredian passport." His voice carried the unmistakable tone of genuine confusion, not defiance. It was the kind of confusion that made people hesitate, question their assumptions. The supervisor's lips pressed into a thin line. "Please, follow me," he said. The traveler was led into a small, windowless room off to the side of the terminal. It was stark and unwelcoming, with plain white walls, a single metal table, and 2 chairs. A fluorescent light buzzed softly overhead. He took a seat without complaint, setting his briefcase on the table as the supervisor explained the need for further checks. Minutes turned into hours. Officials examined the passport, the stamps, the pages, and the materials. Experts were called in to verify its authenticity, and databases were scoured for any mention of Taured. Nothing came up. No records, no references, no country. Meanwhile, the man answered every question with unshakable consistency. His name, his purpose for visiting Japan, the details of his life in Taured, it all flowed naturally, with the kind of ease that made lying seem impossible. His frustration grew, but it never crossed into anger. Instead, it was the quiet, resigned frustration of someone who felt like the world had inexplicably turned against him. The officials examined his briefcase next. Inside were business documents that appeared legitimate at first glance, but listed company names and addresses that led to dead ends. There was currency from various countries, all real and usable, as well as a checkbook with the emblem of a Tauridian bank. Yet, like the passport, nothing matched any existing records. By the time night fell, the room was filled with whispers of disbelief. The officers didn't know what to make of him. Was this some kind of elaborate hoax? A political stunt? Or was there a more unexplainable truth lingering in the shadows of their understanding? The man sat silently now, his gaze fixed on the table. He looked tired but not defeated. It was as if he, too, was grappling with the growing realization that something was deeply, profoundly wrong. "Can I call my hotel?" he finally asked, breaking the silence. "They must be wondering where I am." A call was placed. The hotel he named confirmed they had no reservation under his name. The man's shoulders slumped slightly, the first crack in his composure. "That doesn't make sense," he muttered under his breath. The officers exchanged uneasy glances. None of this made sense. And yet, there he was, a man from a country that didn't exist, stranded in a reality that didn't align with his own. As the night wore on, the officials faced a dilemma. What do you do with someone who doesn't fit into the framework of the known world? The room felt colder now, or perhaps it was the weight of the unknown pressing down on everyone involved. The man from Taured sat quietly, his hands folded neatly on the table, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. The officials had decided to detain him for the night while they conducted further investigations. They assured him it was standard procedure, but even they couldn't ignore the surreal nature of the situation. A plain meal was brought in: rice, fish, and a small cup of tea. The man accepted it with a polite nod, though his appetite seemed absent. His movements were measured, almost robotic, as if he were conserving his energy for something unseen. The airport staff were abuzz with whispers. Word had spread about the mysterious traveler, and theories ranged from the mundane to the absurd. Some believed he was a spy with an incredibly sophisticated cover. Others thought he might be delusional or suffering from amnesia. And then there were those who whispered of the supernatural, a man caught between dimensions, a traveler from a parallel world. In the early hours of the morning, the room was visited by a senior official. He was a stern, gray-haired man with years of experience etched into his lined face. He carried a folder, thick with documents, and sat across from the traveler, observing him intently. "We've checked every database, every record," the official began, his tone heavy with skepticism. "There's no trace of your country, your business, were you? Can you explain that?" The man from Taured looked up, his expression calm but resolute. "I don't know what to tell you. Taured exists. I exist. This is not a mistake, it's reality." The official leaned back, folding his arms. "Reality?" he echoed, the word laced with incredulity. "Whose reality?" "Because it's not ours." A silence settled between them, thick and unyielding. The official's eyes narrowed as he studied the traveler, searching for cracks in his story, but there were none. The man from Taured didn't falter, he didn't fidget or stammer. He was either the most skilled liar the official had ever encountered, or he was telling the truth. "What do you remember before arriving here?" the official pressed. The man's gaze drifted downward, as if he were searching his own memory for answers. "It was a normal day," he said slowly. "I boarded my flight in Taured, bound for Tokyo. I've made this trip many times before. There was nothing unusual." He paused, his brows knitting together. "But when I arrived, everything was wrong." "Wrong how?" "The signs," he replied. "The layout of the terminal. Even the uniforms you're wearing, they're different. Subtle, but different." The official frowned, his skepticism deepening. "And you're certain you've been here before?" "Absolutely," the traveler said firmly. "The Tokyo I know is not this one." The official closed the folder with a sharp snap and stood. "We'll keep you here for now. Perhaps something will come to light." The traveler said nothing as the door closed behind the official. He was alone again, left with nothing but his thoughts and the faint hum of the fluorescent light above. In another part of the airport, a small group of security personnel was tasked with monitoring the man. They watched him through a surveillance feed, noting his every movement. "He doesn't look dangerous," one of them muttered, leaning back in his chair. "Maybe not," another replied, "but something's off." "I mean, who shows up with a passport from a country that doesn't exist?" The first guard shrugged. "Could be a prank. Or maybe he's just confused." "Confused or not," the second guard said, lowering his voice, "I've got a bad feeling about this." As the night wore on, the traveler began to pace the room, his calm demeanor giving way to restlessness. He stopped at the single small window, peering out into the darkened runway beyond. The city lights of Tokyo glittered in the distance, a familiar yet alien sight. He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. In his mind, he pictured his home, a modest apartment in the heart of Taured, the bustling streets he walked every morning, the office where he spent long hours managing logistics for international clients. It all felt so real, so vivid. But here, in this version of Tokyo, his life was a ghost, a series of memories with no anchor in reality. He thought of his family, his colleagues. Were they looking for him? Did they even exist in this world? The weight of the questions pressed down on him, heavy and suffocating. Yet beneath the confusion and frustration, a single thought began to take root, a chilling possibility that sent a shiver down his spine. What if he wasn't supposed to be here at all? The morning came too slowly, bringing with it the muted bustle of the airport's operations. The traveler from Taured had not slept. He sat on the edge of the cot they'd provided, staring at the blank wall, his thoughts circling like vultures. Despite his calm exterior, his mind was a maelstrom of confusion, frustration, and a growing sense of dread. Outside the holding room, the senior official from the night before convened a meeting with his staff. They had spent hours cross-referencing databases, running the man's fingerprints, and even consulting with international intelligence agencies. Nothing. The man was a ghost, a non-entity. "This is impossible," one of the junior officers muttered, shaking his head as he scanned the file. "How can someone just not exist?" The senior official's face was grim. Either he's part of an elaborate scheme or, he hesitated, his skepticism wrestling with the unexplainable. Or something else is at play here. One of the analysts, a young woman with sharp eyes and a knack for pattern recognition, spoke up. "Sir, there's something odd about the documents he's carrying. The stamps on his passport, some of them match existing designs, but others don't. It's like they're from another timeline." The room fell silent. The word timeline hung in the air, unspoken but understood. It was an idea too far-fetched to voice aloud, yet it clawed at the edges of everyone's thoughts. Meanwhile, the traveler remained in his room, but his restlessness had grown. He examined every inch of the small space, his fingers brushing against the smooth, cold surfaces as if searching for something. He stopped at the small mirror mounted on the wall, staring at his reflection. For the first time, he noticed something he hadn't before, a faint distortion in the glass. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but it was there. When he moved his hand close to the surface, the image rippled, like water disturbed by a pebble. He recoiled, his heart pounding. Was it a trick of the light? Or was it something more? Summoning his courage, he pressed his palm flat against the mirror. The distortion spread, the surface bending and warping under his touch. It was as though the mirror wasn't a mirror at all, but a thin barrier separating him from what? He yanked his hand back, stumbling away from the wall. The distortion faded, leaving the glass smooth and unbroken once more. "What is happening to me?" he whispered to the empty room. The senior official returned a short while later, accompanied by a psychologist. They entered the room cautiously, as though approaching a wild animal. "Good morning," the official began, his tone measured. "We've brought someone to speak with you. This is Dr. Nakamura." The traveler nodded politely, though his mind was elsewhere, still reeling from the encounter with the mirror. Dr. Nakamura pulled up a chair and sat across from him, her demeanor calm and professional. "We'd like to understand more about you," she said gently. "About your life in Taured." The traveler hesitated, glancing at the official before meeting the psychologist's gaze. He began to speak, describing his city in vivid detail, the architecture, the culture, the landmarks. He spoke of his job, his family, his daily routine. But as he talked, he noticed something odd. The psychologist was nodding, listening intently, but the official seemed distracted. His eyes kept drifting toward the mirror, his expression tense. "Sir," the traveler prompted, his voice cutting through the room's quiet. The official snapped his attention back to the conversation. "Continue," he said curtly. The traveler frowned but did as he was told. Yet his mind was no longer focused on his own words. Instead, he began to wonder, what was the official hiding? Hours passed. The traveler was left alone again, the uneaten remains of his lunch sitting on the small table. He stared at the mirror, the memory of its distortion gnawing at him. Finally, he couldn't resist. He approached the glass again, his movements slow and deliberate. This time, he didn't touch it. Instead, he leaned in close, peering into its depths. At first, he saw only his reflection. But then, just for a moment, he thought he saw something else. A flicker of movement, a shadow passing behind his image. He jerked back, his pulse racing. Whatever this was, it wasn't natural. Elsewhere in the airport, the senior official sat in his office, reviewing the surveillance footage from the holding room. He had watched the traveler's interaction with the mirror over and over again, and each time, he felt a chill run down his spine. Because the footage didn't just show the traveler touching the glass. It showed the distortion. The official leaned back in his chair, his hand trembling slightly as he reached for his phone. "Get me the science division," he said into the receiver, his voice barely steady. "Why?" came the confused reply. "Because," the official said, his eyes fixed on the frozen image of the warped mirror, "I think we're dealing with something beyond our understanding." The traveler from Taured sat on the cot, his thoughts spiraling as the hours dragged on. He could feel it now, a strange pull in the air, as though the very fabric of the world around him was fraying. The room, sterile and unassuming, felt more like a prison with each passing minute. And the mirror, it loomed in the corner, a silent reminder of the unexplainable event he'd witnessed. He couldn't ignore it any longer. The reflection had rippled like liquid, and in that fleeting moment, he had seen something behind the glass, a shadow, or perhaps a silhouette. It wasn't his. Whatever was happening here, it was beyond his understanding. The door opened abruptly, interrupting his thoughts. The senior official entered, followed by a team of individuals in white coats. They carried strange equipment, devices that hummed faintly and emitted occasional flickers of light. "We need to run some tests," the official said, his voice clipped. His calm demeanor from the previous day had been replaced by a cold urgency. "What kind of tests?" the traveler asked, his suspicion evident. "We're not here to harm you," one of the scientists assured him. "We're trying to understand what's happening. To you, to us, to this place." The traveler's stomach twisted. "This place?" The senior official exchanged a glance with one of the scientists. "We believe you may be displaced," he said carefully. "Displaced? Not from here. Not from this reality." The traveler blinked, the words washing over him like a wave. For a moment, he was too stunned to respond. Then he laughed, the sound hollow and sharp. "You're joking." "I wish we were," the official replied. The tests began. The scientists set up their equipment, pointing strange instruments at the traveler and the mirror. He sat still, his mind racing as they worked around him. They murmured to one another, their words too quiet for him to hear, but their expressions were grim. One of the devices emitted a loud beep, and the scientists froze. The woman in charge, a stern-looking figure with glasses perched on her nose, studied the readings, her face pale. "What is it?" the senior official asked. "There's a fluctuation," she said. "Localized around him. It's faint, but it's there. Like, he's out of sync with this reality." The word sent a chill through the room. The traveler stood abruptly, his fists clenched. "I'm standing right here," he said, his voice sharp. "What does that mean?" "It means," the scientist said carefully, "you might not belong to this world. To this version of it, anyway." The traveler's legs felt weak, and he sank back onto the cot. "This can't be real," he murmured. Hours turned into days. The traveler was subjected to more tests, each one more invasive than the last. They scanned his body, his brain, his belongings. They analyzed his passport and documents, comparing them to every known standard. But the more they searched, the less sense it all made. The stamps in his passport didn't match any known country, yet they were undeniably real. The languages on his documents included slight variations of familiar tongues, as if they belonged to a parallel version of Earth. And the mirror, it continued to defy explanation. Each time the traveler approached it, the surface rippled, but only for him. When the scientists or officials attempted to interact with it, the glass remained smooth and solid. "It's like it recognizes him," one of the scientists remarked. "Or like he's a key," another suggested. The senior official said nothing. He stood in the corner, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his eyes fixed on the traveler. Late one night, when the airport was quiet and the holding room was cloaked in shadows, the traveler decided he'd had enough. He approached the mirror once more, his heart pounding in his chest. This time, he didn't hesitate. He pressed his palm against the glass, ignoring the way it rippled beneath his touch. The surface gave way. His hand sank into the mirror as though it were water, and he gasped, jerking it back. The glass re-solidified instantly, but the brief sensation lingered, cool and fluid, like stepping into a pool. He stared at the mirror, his mind racing. Could this be his way out? The thought terrified him, but it also filled him with a strange, desperate hope. The next morning, the senior official returned, his expression tense. "We've contacted some international experts," he said. "They're on their way. Until then, you need to stay put." The traveler nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. He couldn't shake the feeling that his time was running out. That night, when the airport was asleep and the cameras in his room were pointed away, he stood before the mirror once more. This time, he didn't hesitate. He placed both hands on the glass, feeling it ripple and give way beneath his touch. Then, with a deep breath, he pushed forward. The surface enveloped him, cool and liquid, and he disappeared into the mirror without a sound. The next morning, when the senior official and his team arrived, the room was empty. The traveler from Taured was gone. The traveler's senses were overwhelmed as he passed through the mirror. It felt as though he were moving through a viscous, cold liquid, yet his body remained dry. For a moment, he couldn't breathe, couldn't see, everything was darkness and silence, an infinite void that pressed against his mind. Then, suddenly, he emerged on the other side. He stumbled forward, gasping for air, his heart pounding in his chest. The world around him was both familiar and alien. It resembled the airport, but everything was off, colors were muted, and the air felt heavy, charged with an unexplainable energy. The terminal was empty, its fluorescent lights flickering weakly. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the walls, shifting as though alive. The traveler turned in a slow circle, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Hello?" he called out, his voice echoing strangely. There was no answer. He walked cautiously down the corridor, his footsteps eerily silent on the polished floor. The place was deserted, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He glanced over his shoulder repeatedly, but nothing was there, only the shadows, twisting and shifting like smoke. As he moved further into the terminal, he noticed subtle changes. Signs were written in a language that resembled English, but wasn't quite right, letters bent and curled in ways that defied logic. The advertisements on the walls featured faces that were too symmetrical, their eyes too large, their smiles unnervingly wide. The traveler shuddered, quickening his pace. He passed gate after gate, each one leading to a jet bridge that disappeared into an impenetrable fog. At one gate, he paused. The display board above it flickered, showing destinations that didn't exist: Ardina, Knox Vale, the Forgotten Shore. He stared at the words, a sense of unease curling in his stomach. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw movement. He spun around, his heart hammering. A figure stood at the end of the corridor, half shrouded in shadow. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. It stood perfectly still, its form indistinct, as though it were made of smoke. The traveler took a hesitant step forward. "What do you want?" The figure tilted its head, the movement slow and deliberate. Then it raised an arm, pointing down the corridor. The traveler followed the direction of its gesture, his pulse racing. At the far end of the terminal, a single door glowed faintly, its outline shimmering with an otherworldly light. When he looked back, the figure was gone. He approached the door cautiously, his every instinct screaming at him to turn back. But something compelled him to move forward, a strange pull, like an invisible thread tugging at his very soul. The door was unmarked, its surface smooth and featureless. He reached out, his hand trembling, and grasped the handle. The instant he touched it, a surge of energy coursed through his body, making him gasp. The door swung open on its own, revealing a room bathed in soft, golden light. Inside, a desk sat in the center of the room, and behind it, an older man in a crisp suit was waiting. "Come in," the man said, his voice calm and inviting. The traveler hesitated but stepped inside. The door closed silently behind him. "Please, have a seat," the man gestured to the chair opposite him. The traveler sat down, his body tense. "Who are you? What is this place?" The man smiled faintly. "You have many questions, and I will answer them in due time. But first, tell me, why did you come here?" "I didn't mean to," the traveler said, his voice barely above a whisper. I needed to know what was happening to me." The man nodded, folding his hands on the desk. "You are caught between worlds, my friend. Between what was and what could be." The traveler frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means," the man said, his tone gentle but firm, "that you are a traveler not just of places, but of realities. The world you knew, the one you came from, is not the only version of existence. There are countless others, each with its own rules, its own truths." The traveler's mind reeled. "That's impossible. And yet, here you are." The man leaned forward slightly, his expression serious. "The mirror was a doorway, one that should have remained closed. But now that you've stepped through, you cannot simply return. You must make a choice." "A choice? To move forward or to go back?" The traveler stared at him, his chest tightening. "What happens if I go back?" The man's smile faded. "You will never be the same. The world will feel wrong, as though it no longer fits you." "And if I go forward?" The man's eyes softened. "You will step into a new reality, one where your existence has meaning beyond what you've known. But it will come at a cost." The traveler swallowed hard. "What cost?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he gestured toward another door that had appeared on the opposite wall. Its surface shimmered with the same golden light as the first. "The choice is yours," the man said simply. The traveler rose slowly, his legs unsteady. He walked toward the glowing door, his heart pounding in his chest. As he reached for the handle, he glanced back at the man. "What's on the other side?" he asked. The man smiled faintly. "Only you can find out." With a deep breath, the traveler turned the handle and stepped through. The golden light enveloped him, and for a moment, he felt weightless, suspended in the void. Then the light faded, and he found himself standing in a place unlike anything he had ever seen. But before he could take it in, he heard a familiar sound, a voice calling his name, faint but unmistakable. He turned, his heart racing, and realized that the journey was far from over. The voice calling his name grew louder, more insistent, yet it seemed to echo from nowhere and everywhere at once. The traveler turned in circles, his surroundings blurring together in a kaleidoscope of color and light. He couldn't tell if he was standing on solid ground or floating in a void. Everything felt surreal, as if he had stepped into the space between dreams and reality. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice cracking under the weight of his fear and confusion. The answer came in a low, resonant tone that seemed to reverberate within his very bones. "It is you." The traveler's breath caught. "Me? What are you talking about?" The swirling colors around him began to coalesce, forming shapes and shadows. He blinked, and suddenly, he was standing in the middle of a familiar scene, his childhood home. The scent of freshly baked bread wafted through the air, and sunlight streamed through the windows, casting warm patterns on the wooden floor. He took a hesitant step forward, his eyes wide with disbelief. This can't be real." But it was real, down to the smallest detail. The creak of the floorboards under his feet, the worn edges of the rug in the living room, the faint hum of a radio playing an old tune in the kitchen. And then he saw her. His mother stood at the counter, her back to him, humming softly as she prepared a meal. She looked exactly as he remembered, her hair tied back in a loose bun, her floral apron slightly askew. "Mom?" he whispered, his voice trembling. She turned, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. Her face lit up with a smile, and she opened her mouth to speak, but then the scene shattered like glass, dissolving into 1,000 shimmering fragments. The traveler staggered backward, clutching his head as a wave of dizziness overwhelmed him. When he opened his eyes, he was no longer in his childhood home. Instead, he stood in a barren wasteland, the sky above him a deep, foreboding gray. Ahead, a figure sat on a stone, hunched over as if weighed down by an unbearable burden. The traveler approached cautiously, his footsteps crunching on the dry, cracked earth. As he drew closer, he realized the figure was himself, or at least, a version of himself. The man on the stone looked older, his face lined with sorrow and regret. "Who are you?" the traveler asked, his voice barely audible. The figure lifted its head, and the traveler saw his own eyes staring back at him, filled with a haunting emptiness. "I'm who you could become," the figure said. The traveler recoiled, shaking his head. "No. That's not possible." "It is," the figure said, rising to its feet. "If you choose to go back." The traveler's mind raced. The man in the suit had warned him that returning to his old life would come at a cost, but he hadn't understood what that meant until now. The world he knew would never feel right again, and he would carry the weight of this experience like an invisible scar, forever out of place in a reality that no longer fit him. But was stepping forward any better? The thought of leaving everything he had ever known behind, his family, his friends, his life, filled him with a deep, aching sadness. "What do I do?" he asked, his voice breaking. "How do I choose?" The figure stepped closer, its expression softening. "There's no right answer. Only what you can live with." The traveler closed his eyes, his chest heaving as he wrestled with the decision. Memories of his life flashed before him, the laughter of loved ones, the pain of loss, the simple joys and sorrows that had shaped him into the person he was. And then, he thought of the mirror, the strange world he had stepped into, and the man in the suit's words, "You are a traveler not just of places, but of realities." When he opened his eyes, he was back in the glowing room with the man in the suit, sitting across the desk. The man watched him with an expression of quiet understanding. "Have you decided?" the man asked. The traveler nodded slowly. "I'll go forward." The man's smile was gentle, almost sad. "Very well. But remember, every choice has its consequences." The traveler rose from his seat, his legs steady despite the weight of what lay ahead. He walked toward the door on the opposite wall, its golden light pulsing softly, as if it were alive. He placed his hand on the handle, took a deep breath, and stepped through. The world on the other side was unlike anything he had ever imagined. It was both alien and familiar, a place where the boundaries of time and space seemed to blur. He felt a sense of freedom, of possibility, as though he had been unshackled from the constraints of his old life. But as he moved forward, exploring this new reality, he couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching him. And then he heard it again. A voice, faint but unmistakable, calling his name from the shadows. The traveler paused, his heart pounding, and turned toward the sound. The journey, it seemed, was far from over.